Sean bienvenidos. Estamos reiniciando el live stream puesto que tuvimos un asunto de conexión. Déjenme ver si ya quedó. Listo. Hi, Lauren. How are you
Hi,
doing? Good to see you.
nice to see you.
It seems like we were having some issues, but it's all ready to go, right?
Sounds good.
Very well. So first and foremost, huge honor. It's our real pleasure to meet you finally. And I gotta say, I got in touch. Oh well, I knew from you from Dr. Stu Phillips. I reached out to him to do a live stream when he was busy at the time. So he told me about the work you were doing, and then I think it was the very same week you did that episode on the Iron Culture podcast. So I went like, oh man, I must try to reach out. So thanks a lot for taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Very well. So, Lauren, I wanted to begin, if you're okay with it, by talking a little bit about your work and your recent interest and research, which, if I'm not mistaken, got a little bit troubled by COVID-19, on menstrual cycle and exercise performance, because I think it's a really interesting topic that can easily be misrepresented and ill used to sell programs, to sell supplements, to sell whatever, right? So I wanted to ask you about your interest. What are you exactly doing in your own particular research? And again, thanks for taking the time.
Sure. So I think back when I started my master's work, I was really interested in focusing on sex-based differences or doing research specifically in women because I felt that there was a lack of research in women and a bit of a propensity to exclude women from research. And I learned that a big part of the reason that most researchers were excluding women from exercise science research was because of this possibility that the menstrual cycle would influence the outcomes. And so, basically it was just easier to do it in young men because although there are some kind of fluctuations in testosterone throughout the day, when you think about the levels of testosterone, throughout the month, you're not seeing huge fluctuations. Whereas in women who are not on birth control pills or hormonal contraceptives, then you're seeing pretty dramatic fluctuations in the female sex hormones. So uh, it was very interesting to me that there was this thought around excluding women from these studies, despite a really sufficient evidence to support the fact that the hormonal fluctuations would really alter the outcomes.
That's really interesting that you mentioned because not so long ago, it was a in-house analysis by Greg Knuckles, which I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, that found that I think it was about 60% that research in nutrition and also exercise science were conducted in men, is conducted in men. And one of the possibilities for this phenomena is that women are a little bit more complex to study. Do you think that's really the case that we see most of the studies being carried out in men? Or maybe there are some other possible reasons before digging into the menstrual cycle and exercise performance topic?
I think we not only see this in exercise science, but in a variety of other industries as well. And so in medicine as well, you see that there are studies conducted in men. There's pharmaceutical studies that are conducted in men, and then it's just sort of assumed that it will probably translate to women. And in some cases it does, and that's fine. And in other cases it doesn't. And so I think, in order to really be thorough, then we need to either replicate those studies in in women, or we need to have a sample that includes both sexes.
Very well. Do you think it's a reason strong enough to justify this really unequal research in both men and women? Or maybe there's a little things that we don't take into account, like, I don't know, the availability of subjects, that maybe women don't really want to take part in some of these studies, or what other reasons do you think there? Because I know you are a researcher yourself.
Yeah.
What have you found in the trenches?
I would say that, perhaps maybe 10, 20 years ago, there weren't as many women who are lifting weights, but these days, there are plenty of women in the university age, the kind of 18 to 30, who are lifting weights, and who are eager to participate in research. And so from my experience, even being in a lab as a student and speaking with my supervisors and saying, oh, what do you think about using female subjects? I feel like there is either this sort of unknown about, oh, well, do we need to track the menstrual cycle? Do we need to be aware of it? Do we need to make sure that everybody starts the study on the same day of their cycle? Or are we going to get criticized when we try to submit this to a journal, but we didn't take that into account? And so I think that one of the big hurdles is that, as an industry and in the literature, we haven't really come to a consensus in terms of how much this matters. And until we do, it's going to be hard to justify including a male-female sample without somehow addressing the fact that you didn't account for the menstrual cycle.
Very well. I'm glad we got into this topic. I didn't have it in mind, but I'm glad you mentioned it. Digging into the menstrual cycle itself, I wanted to ask you, well, begin by asking you and then develop into that, about the role of estrogen, because I know a lot of research is conducted in animal models, and there are some things that we might or might not know, and there are some extrapolations in practice, I would say, that it's something like estrogen, it's all that it's good during the menstrual cycle. Early in the early follicular phase, as it goes by, and then it goes up, and then it goes down during the luteal phase, and progesterone goes up. Then it's the bad side of the follicular, of the menstrual cycle, I'm sorry. And then based on that, we will need to do some sort of modifications to our program, even to our diet. I have seen some nutritional plans adjusted for this. So can we begin by understanding a little bit about what do we know and what we don't really know all that well about estrogen, Lauren?
Sure. Yeah, I think that what, as you say, what we know about estrogen and skeletal muscle is primarily rooted in some animal work that looks at an overectomized model, which means removing the ovaries from a rodent. And then we're talking about the total absence of the hormones. And in that case, we do see that there is some detriment to remodeling and to repair and perhaps to maintenance of the muscle. And so some of that has been extrapolated to say that in a period where estrogen is high, which in a human menstrual cycle would be the end of the follicular phase, or let's say it's the second week of the menstrual cycle, that we would have some sort of anabolic response. Because if in the animal model we see that the absence of estrogen is a bad thing, then the presence of estrogen must be a good thing. So this sort of heightened period of estradiol must be anabolic. It is sort of where we've gone with this. And that has translated into this concept of phase-based training, where the idea is that if you have most of your volume in the follicular phase, or the first half of your cycle, then you're kind of maximizing the anabolic response, as opposed to evenly distributing it throughout the cycle.
It's kind of funny because when we talk about males, estrogen suddenly becomes the worst thing you can have, high estrogen levels. But when you talk about females, it's all good. So where is the confusion? When does it become bad? Why is this happening, right?
Yeah, that's a bit confusing, right? But I'd say when we think of testosterone in men, and we think of that as being very anabolic, or trying to maximize, this window of the post-exercise anabolic response, given this brief increase in the androgen levels, then we're really not seeing an influence, long term, right? Maybe we do get this little bump in testosterone post exercise, but does that translate into long-term hypertrophy? Not as far as we see. Really, the influence of testosterone is really potent, either in adolescence, when you're growing, or in these super physiological levels. So when we're talking about injecting testosterone, or and so otherwise, when we see it in a kind of normal range in men, then as long as you're within the normal range kind of for you, then we don't see a big impact of that. And my feeling is that the same thing is true for women and estrogen and progesterone, but even more so, because these fluctuations are so short term that we're to say that, okay, we need to really take advantage of these 5 days where estrogen is high, it seems it seems like a stretch to me, frankly, because when we look at these hormonal fluctuations, it's such a short period of time where we see this spike. And so to think, oh, that's going to be so stimulatory and so anabolic that it's going to influence muscle growth in the long term, it really reminds me of the same concept in men, where you think, oh, if I see this kind of post-exercise bump in testosterone over a period of hours, then that's going to somehow be important for anabolism as well.
Yeah, totally. Because mechanistically speaking, that would mean that eumenoric women's program would look something like, for about 2 weeks, you're gonna get a lot of volume. Then maybe you get a little bit of strength. Then you need to do a deload in the very same month, and then repeat, assuming that we know exactly when is the follicular phase, when is the luteal phase. So it becomes kind of a strawman, I think, of the menstrual cycle. And like you mentioned, it's kind of a stretch. But mechanistically speaking, and I don't know the reason personally why it became so popular to view training that women need to train in a particular way, because women are just the menstrual cycle. I think it's a little bit funny that some people view it that way, because that would make training really inefficient. We would need to deload pretty much every 2-3 weeks, and I don't think that's a really particular useful application of all this knowledge and all this emerging research. And also, Lauren, a little bit less discussed, and maybe not something as bad as some people think, progesterone. What is the role of progesterone? Does it really have an impact long term, not on a same menstrual cycle, but long term on training adaptations?
We know so little about progesterone.
Why do you think that?
I said that we've extrapolated a lot from the animal model
Sure.
work for estrogen. they haven't even done that for progesterone. So I have very little to share other than the fact that there are progesterone levels in skeletal muscle.
Right.
And, because we see the potential positive influence of estrogen, I think that progesterone has sort of been labeled as either negative for hypertrophy, or as an antagonist, like somehow it's interfering with the positive effect of estrogen. But there's very, very little evidence to back that up. So there's just so much that we need to learn about the role of progesterone. And as you said, with the idea that we're going to kind of periodize training in a given month based on the menstrual cycle, if we're doing that for, let's assume everybody has a 28-day cycle, and so we can, and they ovulate in the middle of the month. So we say, okay, 2 weeks this, 2 weeks that. We're talking about severely cutting down on volume. So then the assumption would be that the positive effect of follicular phase-based training is so potent that it's worth cutting your volume by 75% in a given month, and that is a hard one for me to kind of get behind.
It's really a stretch. I would say it's a long muscle stretch, something like that, because that would be ridiculous training, to tell you the truth. I don't know how that would work. But then, speaking of the research itself, how can you track the menstrual cycle itself, and well, how to standardize if you have a group of women? How do you study? Because there's variations within the very same woman, and within women. So how can you, on the research field, measure it and standardize it?
That's one of the biggest challenges that we face. And when you are reading research or summaries of studies, it's definitely something to look out for, because if you assume that everybody has the same cycle length or the same phase length, then we make some mistakes in the interpretation of the data. So I'll say there is an assumption that the average woman has a 28-day menstrual cycle, and in a 28-day menstrual cycle, the average woman will ovulate on day 14, so right in the middle. And so in that context, then we would say, okay, you have 2 weeks of the follicular phase, and we have 2 weeks of the luteal phase. So that's very convenient for a research purpose, right? But when we actually track cycle length, and when we actually track ovulation timing, we find that it's very, very variable. And so there are women who have a 25-day cycle, women who have a 35-day cycle. There are women who ovulate on day 12. There are women who ovulate on day 22. And so if you think about structuring a phase-based program for a woman with a 30-day cycle who ovulates on day 22, then that means that, okay, we have 3 weeks to do kind of one level of volume, and then we only have 1 week to track the other level of volume, and it just doesn't work out as nicely as to say, okay, we have 2 weeks and 2 weeks, and therefore we can standardize everything. So in my research, we track cycles for a couple months before they even come into the lab. And we also have them do urinary ovulation tests over a period of a week. And so we can really know, okay, this is how long their average cycle is, and this is when they ovulate. And so we know when we say we're testing follicular phase, we're testing follicular phase. When we say we're testing luteal phase, we know we're testing in the luteal phase.
Okay, well, it makes a lot of sense, but seems like a lot of work for you and your colleagues. But man, the city is appreciated, especially with the fact that we have so many research carried out in men. And I wanted, speaking of the research itself, I'm aware of several studies. There's a couple meta-analysis. There's one by Balgrove, 2020, that measured strength-related measures, in EU menorrhagic women.
Mm-hmm.
There's another one, which is McNally, also 2020. What does the research say? Because when you ask women, when I ask friends or clients, they might report that they don't feel so well, that they feel super good. The research, as far as my short reading and limited reading goes, it mostly says that it doesn't really make a difference based on the phase of the menstrual cycle. But can we talk a little bit about that? Dive a little bit into the research itself, Lauren?
Sure. Yeah. I'd say the most thorough meta-analysis and systematic review is the McNulty paper that you mentioned out of Kirstie Elliott-Sales' lab. And that really shows that there's a very trivial effect, if any, to performance acutely, and then also kind of long-term adaptation. So again, we need to kind of distinguish the acute exercise performance. So, you come into the lab and we do a single bout of exercise, and then we see, okay, is it different in one phase versus another? And then if we're looking at the concept of phase-based training, in which we look at longer term strength and hypertrophic gains, the latter doesn't really have enough research to kind of comment. The former, so the more acute, has enough to do a meta-analysis. And McNulty and colleagues have concluded that we really need to be approaching it from an individual basis. So if you are an athlete or if you're a coach, then we need to be communicating with clients and saying, when you're in one phase of your cycle and you feel less motivated to train or you feel more fatigued, then let's kind of auto-regulate and adjust accordingly. But in terms of broad recommendations, we're certainly not at a point to say to women as a whole, yeah, you really need to take it easy during one phase or another of your menstrual cycle.
Right, like for instance, when a client would report that they feel a little less motivated to train, that they feel a little more fatigued, do you think this is more in regards to probably how they experience their own cycle and maybe the awkwardness of bleeding from your genitalia rather than the fluctuations in hormones? Do you think it's more in regards to that, and then we can adjust based on an individual perspective rather than thinking that because she's in the luteal phase, I need to do this, or she's in the follicular? Do you think that's more where we can begin to change a little bit of our understanding of menstrual cycle and exercise performance?
I do, and I think it's important to remember that when we look at a textbook and we see these expected fluctuations in hormones, and you see this huge rise in estrogen in one phase, and then progesterone is very, very low, and then in the luteal phase you see a big rise in progesterone, and then an estrogen is kind of moderate. What we see on an average is that kind of fluctuation, but from an individual basis, we really see the extent to which those hormones fluctuate is not going to be the same from one woman to another, and in some cases from one cycle to another. So when we're talking about coaching our clients, I think we need to definitely collect the data. That's important. And so it's good to know when the cycle starts. It's good to know any kind of symptoms that are associated with that and how that affects motivation to train or fatigue or strength performance. But in terms of how we're programming around that or planning for that, I would say that unless you start to see a pattern with your client or in yourself, you know, if you're kind of coaching yourself, then you should kind of approach it as you would any other auto-regulated program. And maybe you didn't have a great night's sleep the night before,
Yeah,
and
sure.
then I'd approach it the exact same way.
So do you think some practical applications that are actually, well, let's say evidence-based, would be just to auto-regulate, like you mentioned, like we would do with any client, independent of their own sex?
I would, and you know, if you really wanted to dial everything in, then sure, you could track your ovulation using the urine tests. They're available at like the local drugstore if you wanted to do that. They're primarily used for fertility tracking purposes. But if you really wanted to know, I'm in this phase or I'm in that phase, and you really thought, though, there's a big influence in my performance during one half of my cycle versus another, then sure, you know, have at it. But I think that we also, if you're going to go to that extent, you know, to track your cycle and your cycle phase, then you better be sure you're also being very diligent about tracking your nutrition and tracking your sleep and tracking everything else that could possibly influence your performance. Because even if it is going to have an effect, it's going to be very, very small for the average person.
Makes a lot of sense. And there's a particular question that I've been really eager to ask you ever since we set up the date. Lauren, what do we know about premenstrual syndrome? Because I was reading not so long ago an article on examine.com about some article, and they talk a little bit about this. And they mentioned that we don't really know up to date, 2023, what exactly causes PMS, and why does it vary so much from women to women? Because I can recall clients and friends that they can't even move. They have to be in bed for a whole day, and some other they don't even notice. Oh, I'm on my period. Why is it so different of a response from woman to woman? And do we know, or do we have some clues, maybe to put it that way, what causes PMS?
No, I mean, it certainly comes back to the hormones, but you're right. It's dramatically different from one woman to the next, and can also vary from cycle to cycle. And when some women will go on hormonal contraceptives, then that could sometimes help kind of alleviate some of those symptoms. And you know, when you bring pregnancy into the mix, that's a whole other can of worms. And you know, so and in terms of the influence on exercise performance, then if let's say we think the follicular phase is preferable or more anabolic, or however we want to frame it, but that first week we're going to be so overcome with symptoms from the onset of the menstrual period, then that's sort of another reason that you know, makes me scratch my head and think, well, so if the first week we're in pain and we're fatigued and we have cramps, and then we're only saying it's the second week that is going to be just amazing for strength performance. You know, I'm not sure about that one, but for sure, you know, it's something that varies between women, and even within the same woman, like from teenage years to 30s, can vary dramatically. I don't have a good answer for you, and I don't. So I really don't. It affects some people more than others, and there are certain things that we can do about it. But exercise is actually one of the things that is often recommended to alleviate those symptoms.
No, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, because it baffled me that it plain out simple said, we don't really know. I was like, oh, but it's so common. how can we not know? But it makes sense because most of the research is carried out in men, and like we mentioned at the beginning. And also, speaking of cans of worms, I have other two cans of worms for you, if you agree and have the time to learn.
Sure.
The first one is what happens with irregular menstrual cycles, because all that we mentioned up to this point is assuming that a woman is like a clockwork, But when she is not, one example, one particular context I can think about, it's maybe a female physique competitor that lost her menses, maybe due to the duration of her prep, the duration of the caloric deficit. Maybe we began to talk about low energy availability. Then we can talk about relative energy deficiency in sport. Well, overall, how does that influence exercise performance? Because, well, I'm sorry, it sounds ridiculous, but she's still a woman and she's not having her period. So what happens then?
Yeah, there are a variety of reasons for an irregular menstrual cycle or for a lack of menstrual cycle. And as you alluded to, one of the main reasons is low energy availability and low body fat levels. And in that case, we're seeing a downregulation of a lot of processes that will be negative for performance, right? So, if we're underfed and we and we have really, really low body fat levels, then we're certainly not performing to the best of our abilities, because we're just not we're not putting our bodies in an environment that is conducive to optimal performance. So, and frankly, the lack of menstrual cycle is a huge indicator of that for women. And I would say that when women put themselves in that situation for extended period of time, kind of year after year, and then it can be very, very hard to come back to having a regular cycle and really regulate the hormones, and that can be really problematic. But one of the biggest reasons for that is having very, very low body fat levels and not having enough fuel for the performance. So my advice for the physique competitors or dancers, figure skaters, gymnasts, is if you do have to get to a point where you need to be in that state of low energy availability such that you do lose your cycle, then it's very important that you get it back as soon as possible. So a planned kind of increase in calories and decrease in activity to restore the hormone levels such that the cycle does return to normal is certainly preferable for long-term health and performance as well.
Which on a psychological level, I think it's a little of a tough sell, because let's think of the female physique competitor.
Yeah.
And went to really low body fat now percentage. She looks like she never did before, and then all of a sudden she doesn't have her cycle. But we as practitioners advise to increase calories, increase body fat, increase weight, obviously.
Yep.
It's a tough one when we are not in the same, let's say, it sounds kind of odd, but anyway, in the same evidence-based circle. Mm-hmm. Some people might think that they can look like that the whole year round, but it's not sustainable. And how can you, with a client, let's say, how can you make that sell?
It's very difficult, you're right. And I think that a part of that is in our kind of culture of social media, where people tend to share photos of themselves, from the same photo shoot or the same series of photo shoots in 3 months, year round. Then we start to sell this idea that you can look like that year round. But I think it's really important to talk about the cost of that. And even with for the majority of competitors, when they're at a very low calorie intake, then they're not able to go out to eat with their friends, and they have to track every single thing that they eat, and they have to be really diligent with scale weight and possibly cardio on top of that. And so I think that one of the biggest goals should be, okay, we need to get you back to a sustainable, just sort of way of eating for life, and that's not being attached to a food tracking app, and that's not making sure that you travel with a body weight scale. And so the goal should never be to maintain a certain look at the cost of being tied to those kinds of metrics that really keep you from just living a normal life.
Easy to say, but really hard to implement, especially in my own crowd, the physique crowd.
Yeah.
So Lauren, to take advantage of our time, the other kind of words that I wanted to ask you, it's a little bit related, because I've seen some. Well, I'm not a physician, but I've seen this happen, that a woman loses her menstrual cycle, and then the call to action is to take hormonal contraceptives instead of increasing calories, increasing weight. What we really should be focusing on.
Yeah.
Well, maybe those are two subjects, but I wanted to ask you first, what is the impact on the current generation of hormonal contraceptives on exercise performance? And also, why, I don't know if in Canada it's the same, or only in Mexico perhaps, why does this happen? Why can we just go with the nutritional recommendation of increasing calories like you mentioned, and we do go to this other route?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that you bring up. And in a normal weight individual that is having some kind of irregularities, sometimes the hormonal contraceptives are recommended to, quote unquote, restore the cycle. It doesn't really restore the cycle, because when you introduce the exogenous hormones, then we eliminate the natural fluctuations of the endogenous hormones that we would see in a normal menstrual cycle. So in that sense, it's that recommendation has never made a lot of sense to me, to be perfectly honest. But I think in your example, when you have somebody who does not have a cycle because energy availability is too low, and body fat is too low, then that's a very big mistake, because then you're seeing you're kind of saying, oh, there's this solution to this problem, but you're not fixing the problem. Because when you look at the levels of hormones in somebody on hormonal birth control, the hormones are very, very low, because they're not producing it's the same way when a man starts taking testosterone exogenously. You no longer produce it at a normal level endogenously, because you're basically sending the message to the body that we no longer need to do that. And so I think it's really problematic for women to do that under those circumstances, because there's a variety of long-term, potential long-term detrimental impacts of being at those low body fat levels with the low energy availability for a long period of time.
Very well. And I'm really glad we touched this particular topic, because it's really common, at least in the circle I develop in, which is mostly physique and bodybuilding and all this stuff, and mostly people wanting to look better according to their own particular criteria, with usually a little bit more muscle, a little bit less fat. And with women, in my own particular practice, that's what I see almost every day. They always want to be in a caloric deficit, and then we begin having these sort of problems. And it like I mentioned, it's a tough sell. So coming from you, I think I hope it's really helpful for those listening. And also, Lauren, almost to finish up, I wanted to ask you all that it's been mentioned up to this point. What can a woman expect as fluctuations in their own performance during the different phases of their menstrual cycle? And what would be some evidence-based applications like the example of autoregulation?
I think that with the fluctuations in performance are going to be very individualized. So we would really need to look at if any, right? And so I would approach it the same way that you would kind of any auto-regulated program. And so if you have some sort of marker of readiness to train before you start your session, I would recommend implementing that. And then if we start to see a pattern of, okay, in those first week or second week or fourth week or whatever it is of her cycle, we see, oh, her motivation is down, or her 1RM strength is down, then maybe that's not a great time to test 1RM strength, right? Or if motivation to train is down, then maybe we have that week as something with a bit more flexibility, and we say, all right, let's do an upper body push, you pick. Let's do an upper body pull, you pick. And so we have a little bit more room for enjoyment and for the client to choose the exercises. And I think that it would be a mistake to plan. I think a contingency plan is good, but a plan ahead of time is probably unnecessary, because maybe we just saw that for 1 month and it's not going to be a recurring pattern. Personally, I have never seen that in anybody I work with. I've never seen that, during that.
Okay.
I've never seen it, so I've never had to program that way. But I always have a kind of, I also think that ranges are good. So let's say, all right, we should be looking at, an RPE or an RIR range, or let's aim for 8 to 10 reps, not 10 reps. So
Sure.
ranges are good, a contingency plan is good, and communication is good, and data is good. So track it all, and then if we need to, then we can monitor. But as I said, I've worked with tons of women, and I've never needed to implement a menstrual cycle phase-based training program.
That's awesome. So do you think it's safe to say that be wary of those trying to sell menstrual cycle-based programs and nutrition and well supplements? They're a whole lot of beasts to tackle, but maybe even based on the research and your own particular work in the research, maybe it's not that necessary, right? Overkill.
It really reminds me of the supplement industry, people who are trying to sell these kinds of programs,
Right.
because I as one of the few people who have really done the research on this, I would say, please don't buy into it, because it just makes it way more complicated for you in terms of your training. And I would focus way more on just the basic principles of good training and consistency and progressive overload, and really don't get yourself all kind of bogged down in adjusting this based on your menstrual cycle, because we are just not at a point, and if we are, I'll be the first one to let everybody know. When we find that out, I will be the first one to share that. But up until this point, we're not there yet. And even if my research shows that, maybe there is something to this, I would still speculate that there will still be a huge amount of individual variability, as there is with all sorts of programming elements, whether it's rep ranges or rest periods or training frequency. So at the end of the day, a study gives us some information on average, but if you're looking at your own training program or if you're concerned with coaching others, then ultimately we need to look at the individual client, and the research is a great place to start, but it's not the end all be all.
Right, and you really are one of the few people doing research on this particular subject, so we're really thankful for that. And when can we expect research from you? What are your current plans in regards to your own particular work? What are the next steps for you, Lauren?
Today is actually a very exciting day for me because I finished my data collection today.
Oh, glad to hear. I think I saw a story. It was a biopsy, right?
Yeah, so
Cool.
after 178 biopsies, finally done. So very, very happy today. It's been about a year of data collection most days. And so now I have a lot of muscle, a lot of blood to analyze. And I'm hoping to finish my PhD by the end of the year. And over the next couple months, I'll be analyzing the tissue and then subsequently writing up the paper. And I will be very excited to share the findings. Either way, I'm looking at both menstrual cycle phase and also oral contraceptives.
Oh, that sounds super interesting. I'll be really on the lookout for that one. And one last final question for you, Lauren. Are people really, or is it just a myth, all the kind in Canada? They're always apologizing, or is it just the idea we get here about Canada? Because I've never been there.
So I'm not Canadian. I am American. And I moved here to join Stu Phillips' lab almost
Cool.
4 years ago. And yes, well, I'll say this. I grew up in New York City, and so New Yorkers have a reputation for being rude.
They do.
But so as a New Yorker, yes, Canadians are very, very nice.
I'm glad they're treating you well because you're doing God's work on this research. Lauren, so I don't want to take any more of your time. It's been a huge pleasure. I do hope one day we can have you as a speaker here in Mexico. It would be a real privilege and an honor. Thanks for taking the time. I'm looking forward to your research, to its publication, and best of luck on your PhD. And say hi to Dr. Stu for me.
Will do. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and you asked wonderful questions. So really, thanks for having me.
Hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, Lauren.